Welcome to Bizarre Podcast.
Hello guys, and thanks for joining us again. I hope you had a great week and all is going well for you, whatever you may be doing. Last week you may remember that I released the Mandela Effect episode, which I'm very pleased to say has done quite well for us. Now, we're not a massive podcast, not by any means, but what I have noticed is that episode is gaining numbers faster than any other episode I've ever released, maybe apart from the Shadow People episode that I released last year. So I just want to say thank you very much for downloading and for sticking with the podcast, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I enjoy making it. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different from last week. It involves a mystery, the disappearance of 3 lighthouse keepers who were manning a lighthouse 20 miles off the coast of Scotland. Now, this story I had heard of maybe a couple of years ago, and then I just totally forgot all about it. And then this week, when I was scouring the internet for a subject to do on the podcast, I stumbled across this story. And instantly I just remembered how much of a good story it was. And I thought, I'd best make an episode quickly before I forget about it again. I am quite absent-minded sometimes. So yeah, before we get started on the episode, I just want to remind you that we have a Facebook group, a great little Facebook group that you can come and join in some of the discussions. And maybe if you want to suggest something for the show, you know, I'm all ears. That would be great if you want to get more involved and suggest some subjects maybe, or just tell me what you think of the show. I'd love to hear your feedback on the show. So without further ado anyway, I give you the mystery of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. If you venture out to sea 20 miles from the west coast of mainland Scotland, eventually you will see the ice-cold waves of the ocean crashing upon a lone solitary island. This lonely island is named Eilean Mor, one of the Flannan Isles, and if you were to look up to the highest point of this island, you would see the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, a lighthouse that is shrouded in superstition and mystery, just like the island that it sits upon. Between the years of 1895 and 1899, construction of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was underway. All the building supplies had to be brought up the 140-foot cliffs from the supply boats, and as you can imagine, this was probably a very grueling task, especially considering how violent the sea can be around that area. And during the construction of the lighthouse, it is worth mentioning that one of the workers did actually lose his life in a freak accident, so already we have one life lost to the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. Finally, after years of hard work, the lighthouse was finally finished, complete with its own small railway that was controlled by a pulley system to bring fuel, food and other supplies from the boats up to the lighthouse. All that was needed now was 3 good men to operate the isolated lighthouse that stood 20 miles from the coast of Scotland. These 3 men were called James Ducat, Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur. Little did these 3 men know that when they were taking the job that their names would go down in history and forever be associated with a disturbing mystery. And even to this day, people can only speculate to what actually happened to the 3 men. No one actually knows for certain. And so the 3 men took up their posts and everything was fine to begin with. The lighthouse had been operational for just under a year with no accidents to record. And there was also a 4th lighthouse keeper who stayed on shore and rotated with the men on a regular basis. Now, as I said, everything was going okay with no issues. That is until a steamer vessel that was on a journey from Philadelphia to Leith sailed close to the lighthouse on the 15th of December 1900, and the weather conditions were not great. So it came to a shock to discover that the lighthouse was unoperational. No light shined out towards the sea, as if it was unmanned. So when the steamer vessel docked in Leith on the 20th of December, it was reported to the Northern Lighthouse Board, who planned to send a relief vessel to make sure everything was okay. Unfortunately, this voyage would have to wait due to bad weather, and the help only arrived at the lighthouse on the 26th of December. The crew and the 4th relief lighthouse operator worker arrived near the shore of the lighthouse, and the signs that something was wrong was already apparent. The first signs that something was amiss are as follows. The flag staff had no flag. All of the provision boxes were still on the loading stage for restocking, and strangely, none of the Lighthouse men had come down to greet them. Something wasn't right. They sounded the ship's horn and even set off flares in an attempt to grab the attention, but it was pointless, there was no response. And so it was decided that the 4th relief keeper and Mr. Joseph Moore would be sent to shore, alone in a boat, to find God knows what. And when he arrived at the lighthouse grounds, he discovered that the main gate and the main door were both shut. Once Joseph Moore had made his way inside the lighthouse, he found that every single bed had been left unmade, and the clock on the wall no longer ticked. It was frozen in time, and the 3 men were nowhere to be found. Now, it is worth mentioning that there is another version of this story where Joseph found dinner plates on the table with food that had hardly been touched, as if the men had to get up quickly and leave the dinner table and leave the food uneaten. But this may be a hoax that was introduced later on in a magazine, but this has never been proven, so it may be true, it may not. And I only mention this because there is another story which states that every bit of dining ware, every plate, every knife, fork, cup was all cleaned up and put away. There was none of that actually out on the table, according to certain stories. And I think that version of the story probably does have a little bit more credence. I think it was actually in the report that was filed after they discovered that these 3 men had vanished. So we're going to go with that the cutlery had all been cleaned up and put away. So, later on Joseph Moore would return to the lighthouse with more crew members to continue the search, and it was revealed that the lamps in the lighthouse had been cleaned and refilled. Also, a set of oilskins were found, meaning that one man may have left the lighthouse without them, and the only real signs of anything sinister was an overturned chair in the kitchen area near the table. Now, none of the lighthouse keepers were found either in the lighthouse or on the small island outside, and it seemed they had simply vanished into thin air. Bravely, Moore and 3 volunteers stayed at the lighthouse to man the light, whilst the captain of the ship sent a telegram that was sent on the 26th of December 1900, and here is what it said. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane. Now back to this story, the men left on the island continued to search in desperation to find some kind of clue as to what had become of the 3 men. Everything seemed fine until they looked at the west landing. There was evidence of a recent storm due to lots of damages. A box 108 foot above sea level had been smashed open and its contents were everywhere. Also, iron railings had been bent out of shape, and the supply railway line was also damaged. It had been pulled out from the concrete. And also they found a massive rock which weighed over a ton, which was completely out of place. Also, a load of turf as well was found out of place. Now, all of this was very strange, there is no doubt about that. But it was about to become even stranger when the lighthouse logbook was discovered with some strange entries. The first entry was on December the 12th. Tom Marshall reported that they were all experiencing severe winds that he had never seen before in all these 20 years. He also reported that James Ducat had been very quiet and Donald MacArthur had been crying. Now, what you got to remember is that these men, especially MacArthur, who was a veteran mariner, he was a strong man, and he was a man who was said to like to have a brawl or two now and again, so he was a fighter. These are not the kind of men to break down in the face of bad weather, given their character and also given their experience. So yeah, it was a bit strange to hear that the men were crying and that they'd become withdrawn within themselves. Anyway, we get to the 13th of December and the next entry states that the storm was still going strong. And it also stated that all 3 men had been praying to God. Why would 3 experienced lighthouse men, 150 feet above sea level, feel the need to pray when they knew they should be safe inside the lighthouse? It was puzzling. But it was about to get more confusing due to the fact that on this date, up until the 14th, no storms were actually reported, so apparently, according to some, there actually wasn't any bad weather on those dates in the logbook. And then finally, on the 15th of December, the last entry to be made simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." Now, it is suggested that the log may have been a hoax by another magazine in the 1920s, but this isn't 100% proven. Now, what actually happened remains a mystery, but a report written by the superintendent of the Lighthouse board stated as follows: "From evidence that I was able to procure, I was satisfied that the men had been on duty up until dinner time on Saturday the 15th of December, and that they had gone down to secure a box in which the mooring ropes, landing ropes, etc. were kept, and which was secured in a crevice in the rock about 110 feet above sea level, and that an extra large sea had rushed up the face of the rock and had gone above them, and coming down with immense force had swept them completely away." Now, you would think that this explanation would be satisfactory for most people, but of course this was the early 1900s and superstition was common, and it wasn't long before people were coming up with their own theories as to what happened. First of all, there was a theory that a massive sea serpent had devoured the lighthouse keepers. The second theory was that a giant monstrous seabird had swooped down and carried the men away to be eaten. Now also, I should have actually mentioned this earlier, the island also has a very small chapel named the Kennel, which was named this by the lighthouse keepers due to its small size. Now, it's believed that it was built by a 7th century Irish missionary and preacher, St. Flannan, who would have also given his name to the island. Now, it's believed by many that the phantom, the ghost of this preacher, is still roaming around the island, and he doesn't take kindly to guests, and he may be responsible for the disappearance of the 3 lighthouse keepers. There have actually been old superstitions written down about people visiting the island to hunt for birds, and they wouldn't stay too long because they were scared that the ghostly apparition of the preacher would appear and curse them. And I just thought that was quite spooky. The next theory even goes as far as to say that the 3 lighthouse keepers could have been abducted by aliens and taken off into outer space. That's probably a more recent theory, I should imagine. Or maybe a murderer came upon the island and killed all 3 of the lighthouse keepers. What do you think? Do any of these theories sound plausible? Well, if not, the more rational explanations are as follows. It's believed that the formation of the cliffs in the area could cause a massive funnel of water that could shoot up to the land where the men were working hard to secure their stock, and this rogue wave swept them all into the sea where they perished. This isn't that far off from the report that the superintendent posted. Another theory is that maybe 2 of the men found themselves in a spot of bother and called for the 3rd men, who left the lighthouse in a rush without his oilskins to help, but unfortunately they all came to some unfortunate end. Also, there is the possibility that one of the men had become emotionally unstable due to the isolation and the bad weather, and possibly killed the other 2 men, and then probably out of guilt decided to kill himself. This theory is mainly due to the entries in the logbook and the overturned chair, which suggests that maybe a struggle or a fight broke out. Another uncertain factor is why there isn't at least one survivor, as it is stated that the lighthouse must be manned at all times by at least 1 man. No exceptions, these were the rules. Which again probably means that the other 2 men who were in some kind of serious danger possibly swept out to sea, and the 3rd man left his post unmanned in an attempt to rescue his friends. But it was only recently a few of these theories were put together with some new evidence. Now, according to recent findings, one of the lighthouse keepers, Thomas Marshall, had been previously fined 5 shillings for losing his equipment and not storing it correctly. So it's believed that when this storm hit, the man became worried about this, and 2 of the men went out in the bad weather to try and secure their gear, and whilst doing this, they were hit by a massive wave that dragged them out to sea. And it is then believed that the 3rd man then rushed to help his friends, leaving his oilcloths behind in his attempt to reach his friends, only